context for the future. Well, if that were the case, the way things were going back in 2003, today we'd all be driving around in 3,000 litre engines, V48s, and birds would be falling from the sky at the sheer audacity of us. But no, instead, we're all driving around in milk floats and frantically hunting for the nearest charging point. But back in 2003, two amazing things did happen. This, the Mercedes SL55, the R230 platform, and the wonderful Mercedes McLaren SLR C199 R199. Both absolutely bonkers, both sticking a finger up at efficiency and MPG at the time and just chucking out power levels and sounds that were almost unheard of and, quite frankly, a little bit naughty at the time. But I drooled over both those cars. I drooled over this car and I drooled over the SLR. Now, I can't quite stretch to getting hold of an SLR today because they don't come cheap. The cheapest I've seen recently, about 250 grand, upwards of that. These, though, on the other hand, you can pick one up for about 15 grand, a good one. Although many owners would like to tell you they think they're worth a lot more than that, as do I. I can't quite figure out why they are such bargains at the moment, but bargains they are. But let's look at the Mercedes McLaren SLR and this together, because I think these cars are far more similar, far closer together, almost part of the same family. Why did that Mercedes McLaren SLR come about? Well, it came about because, as we know, Mercedes and McLaren have always been pretty close bedfellows from an F1 perspective. Sure, back in the day when this car was conceived, the SLR, McLaren used a Mercedes engine in their F1 cars, and they had a stint with Honda recently. But fast forward to today, and of course McLaren once again using a Mercedes power plant, as are Mercedes, the same power plant, although McLaren having a little bit more success with it at the moment than Mercedes. Go on, Lando. Right, but it came about because of this partnership, and they wanted to pay homage to the Mercedes 300 SLR. So Mercedes and McLaren got together and said, let's engineer something that's absolutely crazy in terms of its spec, looks and capability. Now, at the time, the SLR definitely raided the parts bin of this platform for the car. If I was sat in an SLR cockpit right now, I wouldn't feel too far from home. A lot of the switchgear is shared between those two platforms. If you look at the heater controls, absolutely the same, those dials the same. So the parts bin absolutely was raided as much as they could, I think, just to get a quick win out of getting the platform up and off the ground. One area that wasn't compromised on is the body and the engineering of the body. Now, McLaren, doing what McLaren do best, they engineered a carbon monocoque for the SLR. This is just your plain old aluminium subframe in this, but all the engineering went into this platform. And if you look at the SLR now, if you lift up the hood, it is an absolute work of art. Just a beautiful thing to behold. But it is a GT layout in that car, and when it was released, critics weren't too happy about it. Now, the SLR, the R in SLR, is R for Rennsport, which is basically racing sport. But they said it wasn't racing enough. It was too lazy, too much of a GT platform. Especially when compared with the likes of the competition at the time being cars like the Carrera GT, cars like the Ferrari Enzo. That SLR ended up being 1,768 kilos, which is still pretty darn heavy for any car that should be flying around a track. Incidentally, the Carrera GT, that is only 1,360 kilos. So that's one of the reasons that a lot of the critics said, no, it's just too big, too lazy. But I think I think they were kind of missing the point as to what that SLR was meant to be. I really just think it was an exercise in art, really, automotive art, and putting something together that is just beautiful, works well, and at the time was incredibly rapid. Nothing else sounded like these cars at the time. It was absolutely stunning to behold, and yeah, I've always been a fan. Now, if you look also at shared components, one thing that wasn't shared between the SL and the SLR is the suspension. This car, the SL, has this complex ABC system. At the time it was probably the trump card, but has now become the Achilles heel. With age, of course, it goes wrong, it needs repaired, and it can be an expensive element of owning one of these cars, should you not wish to convert to coilovers, which I absolutely do not want to do. I'm keeping it as ABC as I can. The SLR just had standard wishbone suspension, and there were quite a few variants of the SLR produced. Now, the production run of the SLR stopped in 2009. It went from 2003 to 2009. They had a couple of additional variants thrown in. There was the coupe version and the roadster version. There was also a 722 version and a Sterling Moss version. Now, I think of the coupe and roadster, there were upwards of over 1,000 of those made. The 722 version, more limited edition run, and then the Sterling Moss edition, even more limited, to just 75 of those, and they were 750,000 at the time, I think, new, and now upwards of 2 million for one of those. An absolutely bonkers looking thing, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But looking at the SLR, that was, as I said, panned a little bit, and of course in 2010 that meant that values went down quite significantly, in that you could have picked one of those up for about £150,000, which I think represents insane value for money, especially looking at it now when prices of these are absolutely on the up. That Sterling Moss version that I spoke about, absolutely beautiful thing, and a real homage to that SLR, that 300 SLR back in the day. And Sterling Moss, because of course Sterling Moss completed the Mille Miglia race in a 300 SLR, average speed of over 100 miles an hour back in 1955, alongside his co-driver, and their start time was 7:22 AM, hence that 722 version, different from the Sterling Moss version. The Sterling Moss version is an absolutely beautiful thing. No windscreen, no roof, just designed for throwing around a track as quickly as you possibly can. So there was quite a few SLRs produced as a platform, and a real wonderful piece of engineering, as I've said. And a lot of the components are very similar, but there's one area that I haven't touched on yet that makes these cars so similar, and it is their soul. It is that wonderful M113 engine. Both the SLR and this have that wonderful power plant. I've got one sat in front of me right now, and it makes me a very happy man indeed. That is why these cars are so good, so sought after. I'm going to go out on a limb and say this. That is the sole reason why these cars are so good. This engine is one of the best engines ever made in the history of cars. This 5.4 litre supercharged engine is one of the best engines ever made. Now, for the SLR, yes, it was tweaked. In this, it produces 493 horsepower. In the SLR, it has forged rods, it has uprated intercooling capability, a faster Eaton supercharger. It's also dry sumped in the SLR. But at the heart, it is still very much the same car. Absolutely, because of that engine. Now, another part of the engine that is shared between both cars is the 5-speed gearbox. It is a big, lazy gearbox. It was tuned again, I think, for the SLR, just to give it a bit more snappiness. But it's the 722 gearbox, I think, 722, huh? I wonder if they're named that after the Stirling Moss set-off time. Who knows? It's very, very strong, very sturdy. It's supposed to be one of the most bulletproof areas of this car and can seriously take the power and torque that both these cars throw at it. The SLR producing, I think, 617 brake horsepower, which is significant. But it is a wonderful, wonderful engine. And here's the kind of clincher for me, I guess you could say, is that we've said you can get one of these now for about 15 grand, whereas an SLR is going to cost you about £300,000. So you're looking at sort of, less than 10% of the cost of an SLR for one of these. And is one of these 10% of a car that SLR is? Absolutely no way. These things are absolutely awesome cars. They're phenomenal cars, and if you're feeling a little bit brave and fancy getting on board with one at the price they are now is absolutely the time, because I think soon, as that SLR continues to increase in value, these are going to have to as well, because when you stack it up, when you look at these side by side, when you see the visuals of them, when you hear them, of course the SLR are a bit better with those side exit pipes, but when you hear them together, the soul of these cars is absolutely the same, which is what makes these cars so deserving of being well looked after and hopefully becoming a collector's item at some point in the future. That's it for this one. Do stay safe, stay well. See you on the next one, and bye for now.